Aw, man, I wish Rajang was in Iceborne.
Why would you say that? Oh, my horn!
He's so cool!
How could you unleash this upon the world?
I don't know, I just like monkeys.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, it's time to start monkeying around.
By which, of course, I mean talking about a very specific monkey monster, Rajang, the king of the apes, and realistically one of the most iconic monsters in the entire series. Of course, there is Rathalos, the actual flagship of all flagships, but other than that, if you ask 10 random people who had never actually played Monster Hunter before what monster they had heard about regardless, I bet you Rajang probably tops that list. Why? Well, there are multiple reasons. He is a particularly unique monster among the roster, especially when he was first introduced specifically. Yes, he was brought in the same generation as Blanganga and Kongolala, so he wasn't even technically the first monkey-based monster, but he was something special. The hardest non-Elder Dragon creature that we had ever seen before then, really. And his design was pretty simple. A big, beefy, muscly ape who would just smack you aside with his big, muscly arms. Yeah, sure, he had a massive lightning beam, but that was what he was known for, was simply his relentless punching you in the face-itis, a disease unique to Rajang that makes them hate anyone who dares to call themselves a hunter. Since he was added to the series in the second generation, he has been in every single game except for the third generation, where he initially took a break, but then Capcom seems to have decided that that break was a mistake because he hasn't been excluded from one since, and so every game since then has had an all-new and improved Rajang. He is a constant, a monster that we all know, that we all fear, and, well, should it be that way? At the end of the day, he is essentially an unofficial crossover monster, a giant monkey capable of nothing but wanton destruction, whose tail is its weak point, and whose hair turns gold when enraged. Oh, and he shoots beams. Sound familiar for any reason? And the main question that I'm here to ask here today is quite simple. Should he be in the next Monster Hunter game? Do we all love Rajang and his place as a constant intruder into quests, or are the majority of hunters actually starting to get sick of him?
Why are you still here?
Back in older generations of Monster Hunter, Rajang was seen as a sort of rite of passage for hunters, especially for new hunters. His difficulty was legendary, capable of toppling hunters like it was his day job. His speed is ridiculous, his damage just the same, and while people often said that he was squishy to make up for this, a sort of glass cannon, that just wasn't really true. His health pool is generally quite standard, and of course because of his mode where he gets all hot and bothered, by which I mean his arms start glowing red and bouncing off every strike, it can actually be a bit hard to deal consistent damage to the weaker parts of his body, especially as for most melee weapons the weak spot is just the head, which he holds reasonably high off the ground, or on occasion the tail, which again just flings around and is a tiny little target. These days, however, I pose a question. Is Rajang even really still that hard? Don't get me wrong, I don't think he is an easy monster compared to many others by any means, but compared to the legends of him from back in the day, compared to how he actually felt in the older games, modern Rajang is far easier. He serves his place now as an icon more than as a wall, in my opinion. And an important thing to think about, of course, is how monster slots work in these games. If you take out a monster, it can't be replaced with literally any monster. In every game that Rajang has been a part of, another monster might have been looked over though, sent aside. And this has also lowered our chances of getting other Elder Dragon level monsters that aren't Elder Dragons. There is a notable difficulty curve in Monster Hunter games, mostly defined by quest star levels, and they are there for a reason. They denote the general power of the monster in most situations, at the very least the danger that they pose to hunters. Every time Rajang fills one of those higher tier slots, we lose the chance for a new monster to be of that power, especially one that looks somewhat similar to him, being like a fanged beast. Most notably here, I think, is probably Garangolm in Sunbreak specifically. One look at that monster, you think he's a big bad bowl of smackdown soup, ready to tear your head off, but in reality, he's actually quite a low tier monster. He isn't particularly threatening, and I think a big part of the reason for that is, well, the existence of Rajang already in Rise. I have to wonder, if we didn't have Rajang in base Rise, would Garangolm still be the relatively low tier threat that he is, or would they have pumped him up to near Elder Dragon levels? I mean, look at his abilities, look at his size, his sheer size. He can have water and blast at the same time, one on each arm. He straight up rocket jumps around, which is awesome. I mean, he just doesn't sound like he should be as early game a monster as he actually realistically is. And to me, a genuine reason for that is the existence of Rajang himself. Even if you appreciate Rajang personally, you have to admit that his being in every game fills a slot that could otherwise be filled by different monsters, either another returning monster that hasn't been around for ages, or even a new monster being given the same difficulty tier. Of course, it's not one-to-one, but the fact that he has been in all of the recent games when we haven't gotten a modern reincarnation of some of the crazier monsters is just sort of weird to me. Things like Nursilla, or Celtis and Celtis Queen. God, I would pay to fight Celtis and Celtis Queen in Sunbreak specifically with the mechanics we have around. I feel like that would be an incredible experience, but we just don't have it. Or even Najarala, the Snake Wyvern, a class that hasn't been expanded on in ages. Imagine if we had a Rajang tier, Elder Dragon level difficulty that isn't an Elder Dragon, Rajang difficulty brand new Snake Wyvern. Wouldn't that be awesome? Would that not be cooler than just having Rajang for the 6th time? I don't know, maybe I should temper myself a little. I'm not saying that Rajang is a bad monster, or that I don't like Rajang. I don't believe that's true. But I think it's definitely worth a discussion, worth questioning whether his constant inclusion is good or bad. Especially for him. I mean, it must just be so confusing for him. Just every couple of years, he just teleports into a completely unknown locale.
Where the f am I?
And of course, there are two sides to every argument, because even though I think Rajang is easier than he used to be, and even though I think I'd rather find new and surprising threats at his level than just, Rajang again, I can't deny that Rajang is generally speaking a particularly satisfying fight to go through. Every iteration of this fight has its beautiful rhythm. He isn't the most complex monster, but complex isn't synonymous with good. He starts off just generally squishy, some of his attacks can be annoying, but not massively problematic, then he powers up into his enrage, and you can either let the enrage timer time out, or you can start beating up on his tail. Once he's enraged for a bit, he goes all red arm mode and starts dealing damage like all hell, but his tail becomes even weaker, and of course, if you deal enough damage to it, you'll knock him out of the enrage. For the most part, he doesn't have a massive amount of different attacks, and that makes him incredibly learnable. He has patterns that you can memorize, and once you have done so, he becomes very enjoyable to take on, relatively easy to dodge the attacks of, and easy to get your damage in on. As I said, I don't even really dislike Rajang. I just think it's worth wondering what a modern Monster Hunter game might look like without him in it. Another good example here is even in base Monster Hunter Rise, we had another fanged beast of reasonable difficulty in Goss Harag. But again, I find myself asking that question. Could he have been even harder? Would he have been even higher tier if we didn't already have an Elder Dragon level fanged beast in the game? Would Goss Harag have filled that role? That's one I could absolutely believe. Like Rajang, he is more physical than anything. Of course, he has his ice-based quirks, but for the most part, he just slaps and slashes with his arm blades. I mean, he even still does an elemental beam when he enrages, but when I look at him, when I look at his moveset, I find him incredibly satisfying. He, like Rajang, has lots of learnable patterns that I enjoy going up against, but he is notably slower on his attacks than Rajang is, and they do a fair bit less damage as well. But a bumped up, powered up Goss Harag could have been even better, and I say this knowing that he is in my top 5 favorite monsters of all time, even as is. I guess for me, what it most comes down to is this. I go into Monster Hunter games blind, right? I find out what monsters are in them as they show up within my playthrough, and there are certain things that I get quite excited about when I see them, and certain things that are just like, oh, that's there, cool. New monsters are always exciting. Of course, they are a whole special and unique thing, but when it comes to returning monsters, there absolutely are some that still give me that same level of excitement. Seeing Gormagala show up in Sunbreak was awesome because we haven't seen him in this generation. Seeing Daimyo Hermitar show up as the first new monster of the expansion made me incredibly happy. I love the crab monsters. They're incredibly unique as a type of monster, and there just aren't a whole lot of them either. Seeing Espinas happen as the first monster to come from Frontier since the 2nd generation was incredible, and it opened a whole floodgate of possibilities as well. And hell, even seeing some returning faces from as recently as Monster Hunter World was just fun to experience them in a different gameplay environment. But when I saw Rajang was in Monster Hunter Rise, it was just sort of like, oh, you're here. Well, let's fight then, I guess. And don't get me wrong, the fight was good, but when a monster is in the vast majority of Monster Hunter games that have been made, it just isn't all that exciting to see them again. I don't expect massive change-ups in their moveset when this happens, because they are a known quantity, they are changed small bits at a time, and that's alright, but it's just not as exciting. So it becomes, let's just fight this thing that I already know how to fight in this new gameplay environment and see his 1 or 2 changes, I guess, with these new mechanics that we have ourselves as hunters within this game. Not to mention Furious Rajang as well, who has been in every generation that regular Rajang has been in too, and I'll be real, in Sunbreak I was almost unhappy to see this variant. Not because he was there in the game, but maybe it's just me, but after grinding MR for dozens of hours, finally getting to Master Rank 50 to see a new urgent quest, and it's Furious Rajang. He's a cool monster, but it just wasn't the hype moment that I was looking for at that point in the journey. Yes, a monster that wasn't in base Rise, so that part is cool, but it could have been so much more, especially in that slot. There could have been something so much more exciting there. I don't know, maybe I'm weird for having all these thoughts. Do you agree that maybe Rajang should take a break for a generation, come back new and improved in meaningful ways, and really prepare to show new hunters a rough time? Do you think that I'm crazy and Rajang is perfect as is and deserves a slot in every game from now until the end of time? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Rajang is cool and you don't really mind either way.
I have so many questions!
No matter what your stance is, I think this discussion is important and that it does matter, because while we won't generally directly affect the choices that Capcom makes when it comes to the roster of a Monster Hunter game, it is good to understand the concepts that are behind it. The fact that there can only be so many monsters of each distinct threat level, and the idea that including some returning monsters might just be taking spaces away from more difficult full-on new monsters. Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.